4 times now in an effort to best meet the needs of the people in the room. That being said, I tried to go with what would best support the writer, and none of you in the room are writers. So you do support writers. So the beauty in having an intimate group, though, is that I can customize on the fly for you. So make sure that very first thing on the Padlet is the entrance activity. That will kind of help me get a temperature read of the room on the level of background knowledge. Because I know that some of you have written them, some of you have reviewed them, some of you just nod your head and say, yeah, I can help you with that. So that's squeaky shoes. We should, though. Has everybody had a chance to complete that, the welcome activity? Okay, so let's see where we're at. So how to support sites and districts in making sure to make a concerted effort to include equitable practices in their plans. That's my goal for today too. The why, what, and how of a SPSA. I will touch on some of that. The root of those 3 things is an accountability training more than an equity training. But whomever wrote that, if they want to talk offline, I have all the resources you'll ever want for that. And then how to support LEAs in writing an LCAP with actions and services that support all learners. So the beauty, even though today is a SPSA focus, the beauty in this is that SPSAs are now LCAP aligned. So in theory, the writers are supposed to pluck the goal directly out of the LCAP, and then that will be the header, if you will, and then they tailor that goal to their context, and then they do their GAS, their goals, actions, and services according to their context. So while it's not LCAP context, there's a through line. So are we good? Does that feel right? Okay. Yep. Okay. So take a quick respite in that beautiful picture. We've decided that's our new California 1. Going to be our overlay. But it actually is Highway 1. So this is increasing access and equitability in your try that again. It's increasing access and equity in your SPSAs. So if you're not in the right place, please feel free to stay with us. If not, we're not offended if you get up. The California 1 is a equity grant, a statewide equity grant that is got a north-south component. The north component is us here at Santa Clara County Office of Ed with the Inclusion Collaborative, and the south component is San Diego County Office of Ed. But this is the mission statement for the Inclusion Collaborative, our elevator pitch, as we call it. So a little awkward, I know, because right now the people that are in the room are all from the same building, but it's still nice to just take a minute and please introduce yourselves and then tell me what your relation is to a SPSA, if you would, please.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Noah. I work for the Representatives for the Personal Department. And my relation to SPSA is looking at the English grammar and yes, the equity lens.
So I'm going to tap you as another equity expert. Thank you and good morning. I've never heard it called that before. I like that.
So my focus is always on ELA and literacy, along with ELD. So my role or my connection to the SPSA is really looking at how they can have actions and services that really support instructions, and the MTSS role and the instruction side of it.
Thank you and good morning.
Hi, I'm Annie, coordinator, LCAP Advisory Services. So part of this is with our LCAP development and just making sure that districts are using kind of the MTSS structure to develop their LCAPs and make sure that they're having equitable practices. And I also, part of my job is to support schools that are in CSI. And so making sure that their SPSAs, their CSI plans are clear in addressing the needs of their students.
Perfect. Thank you and good morning.
Hi, and I'm mostly Andy's counterpart as coordinator for the LCAP Sharon Johnson. And yeah, we support the district in the writing of their LCAP, and also do a little bit of training along.
You're going to see some of that in here today too. So thank you and good morning. We have other CA1 folks. Thank you and good morning. Thank you and good morning. Last time I put the two of you on the spot, I promise. Okay, it just helps so that you know who you can tap to as added resources. My name is Kelly Wiley. I'm a manager in the Inclusion Collaborative, and a part of my responsibilities is working on the CA1 grant. But in addition to that, I've been a SPSA writer, I've been a SPSA reviewer, I've been a SPSA coach. Similar, so you guys are all in a coaching capacity too. I've been an LCAP writer, I've been an LCAP reviewer, and I've been an LCAP coach. So just so you have some context of where I'm coming from too. And then lastly, to that, I was part of the statewide design team that did the new SPSA template. So when it actually went to do that alignment between the LCAP and the SPSA. So today, really hoping that I don't kill myself, but what we're really, like I said, we're not trying to do this from an accountability standpoint, we're trying to do it from an equity standpoint. So we want to make sure that you leave with some protocols that uplifts student groups that may not be receiving the attention that they need to be receiving. And then once you have those protocols in place and that background knowledge, that you can then catapult that into the strategic planning. Be it a strategic plan, be it a SPSA, be it an LCAP, whatever continuous improvement document the schools are using. They're going to come in a variety of shape or forms and titles. SPSA is required by law if you're a Title I school, or if you're a CSI, TSI, ATSI, nothing like starting the morning with alphabet soup, right? So the comprehensive support, the targeted support, and then the additional targeted support. So comprehensive, the CSI basically means that it was your all student group that qualified you. Targeted, this will be the first year we have actual targeted because we missed the window on the accountability side the first go around because our ESSA plan wasn't yet approved. So targeted is if it's been a year to 2 years, and then ATSI is if it's that target group, student group has exceeded the 2-year mark. So we missed out on year 1 without having our ESSA approved. So by default, all of our targeted student groups went to ATSI. So just so you have some background knowledge. There's 6 components to what is in statute, which then drives ed code. Here's the remaining 3. Most importantly, it's got to be evidence-based. It's got to be rich in data. It's got to involve stakeholders, and you've got to do a needs assessment. That being said, there's no cookie cutter needs assessment, which is nice because that allows for the schools to give it the context that it really does need. There are some additional requirements for the CSI, TSI, ATSI. CSI, if it's a CSI school, the district is responsible for the supports. And the while the SPSA acts as the continuous improvement plan, CSI schools also have to have mention in the LCAP. There is a CSI section within the LCAP. The TSI, ATSI, so the one that's on the right-hand side, when it's a student group or selection of student groups, it falls on the school site. So that's the difference in the supports between the TSI, ATSI, and the CSI. CSI is district, and it has to be represented in the LCAP because there's money attached to it. TSI, ATSI, there is not any money attached to it. Therefore, the school sites are responsible for how they will drive the improvement. And the intent is that the SPSA becomes their continuous improvement document. I feel like I'm blocking your way when I stand there, but then I'm off camera too, so that's okay. So there's 7 dimensions to continuous improvement, and if you look at it, it's like, oh, that looks really familiar because it's almost the exact language that are in those documents. You have to have visions and goals. You have to make sure that there's governance and leadership. You have to make sure that there's teaching and learning. Like this, that should sound familiar, right? Especially for my DA folks, because these are the components in which a district picks a component and then leans into that to do their continuous improvement work. Oh, wrong way. So a little improvement science. John Dewey says that every system is perfectly designed to be getting the results that it's getting. And the cartoon there, although it's blurry, is Big Bob's ball bearing bananas, roller skates, and floor wax incorporated. So roller skates alone, I think, could probably create the mayhem, but then you add all the other barriers in there. I love the roller skate on the stair. So just keep in mind that the system as it's set up now is what's producing the results that it's producing. And if you can't be upset with the system if you're not willing to make the changes. And it's messy work. And it takes time. It's not a quick fix by any means. SPSAs are often, and LCAPs for that matter, are often treated as compliance documents. That was never their intent. Their intent was that it would be a North Star. So I'm going to challenge that we make a mind shift today from the check the boxes, move on, I got it approved, I can cross that off my list, to it becoming a continuous improvement document, and that you take into consideration the design thinking. So this definition for design thinking comes from the National Equity Project. And it's just really uplifting that you be deliberate in making sure that all parties have a voice in whatever it is that you're doing. The tagline that CAST uses is that you design to the edges. With that, going even deeper, there's a liberatory design mindset. This comes out of the D school, the design school at Stanford. That's what your cards are. And I forgot to grab mine. The thought process behind the liberatory design mindset is that the designer needs to be aware of whom they are designing for. And with that, the designer needs to be aware of what they bring to the table and how that may or may not impede the people that they are designing for. There's an amazing book called Mismatch by Kat Holmes. She is an executive at Microsoft. She's on their design team. And she wrote this amazing book about mismatched designs. So it speaks into this when, for example, this kind of mouse, a universal mouse. I'm right-handed. This is amazing. Lefties, epic fail. Because if a lefty's using it and you tell them to right-click, it's the inverse of what a right-click is to a right-handed person. So that's just an example of when liberatory design is not taken into consideration. And then again, there has to be authentic connections. So that being said, in your cards, for the purpose of today, I felt that the recognize oppression card, which is the second one in, and the embrace complexity, which is the third one in, were the ones that really allowed for that authentic connection. And the reason why I chose those were, if you look at the back of the cards, I love belly laughs. I know, I love belly laughs. That's the best. On the recognize oppression, people we are designing with, which is super key, because a lot of times, and I'm guilty having been a writer, so you go in, you close your door, and it becomes an exercise in creative writing. It's really intended to be done with a group. So the people that you are designing with and the challenges they face do not sit in a vacuum. We're able to see root causes, the systematic inequities, and that there's potential to address deeper needs. So those are the three things that really spoke to me as we move forward. And then the questions I thought were incredibly powerful. And then on the complexity piece, I just loved that first sentence, and that equity challenges are complex, and there are going to be moments of ambiguity, and that's okay. So, and then again, I thought the questions really resonated. So this is your lovely parting gift for today. But the nice thing is that the questions on the back are great sentence starters, conversation starters, just to get that deeper thinking going. I know everybody in this room is well versed in the equality, equity graphic. Pick any of the 10,000 graphics. And those of you that have done UDL with me, there's when I do this, there's a third column that takes down the barriers. But because we're not doing UDL, I just really want to look at the equality and the equity. And I liked the definitions on this one and the fact that it was a school setting. So in this one, equality, sameness, giving everyone the same thing. It only works if everyone has the same thing from the start. And then the equity is fairness, which is access to opportunities, and that you must ensure that there's equity work before you can enjoy the quality side of it. So anything that speaks to you about this graphic, and now Barbie, you're on the spot. Is there anything that speaks to you about this particular graphic? I'm walking away now. Like I said, I appreciated that it was a school setting or an academic setting. And I really appreciated the framing in that there has to be the equity before you can enjoy the equality. I'd never quite heard it framed that way before. Correct. Right. So from a design perspective, the equality is going to be your base programs, right? It's what everybody should have access to at any given time and should be able to just jump in and do. Well, we know that our students aren't cookie cutters. They're coming to school with a plethora of added layers. So that's where the equity comes in, and that the equity allows for the individual student to have what he or she needs to then be able to access your base program. Does that help ye? Yes. Okay, no problem.
Yes, I like the example of referring to the base program that everyone has access to, and then the equity is to support students who can access the base.
Right.
I like that. I like the statement underneath that.
It's a little blurry, but right. If I were to be doing my UDL training, though, I'm not sure what that next layer would be. Maybe remove the shelves. I don't know, but right. I don't know that I'll get the exact wording again. And the Zoom is recorded. But yes, if you were going to layer this onto any kind of strategic planning, the equality speaks into your base program, meaning that all the kiddos should have the same access and accessibility to whatever it is that you want to get out of all students. And then the equity component, because the kiddos come with so many layers to them, the equity component speaks into addressing the layers for each kiddo so that once those needs are met, then they can access the base program. Of course. Hopefully that was similar to what was said. Oh, backwards again. My other goal that is my personal goal, so I didn't put it up there, is that you guys have some experiential learning today. So that being said, we're going to do some different case studies. This is an honest to goodness school. This is Eleanor Roosevelt High School. It's actually in Riverside County. So this is a little backstory for them. The Eastvale community is a subdivision of Norco, California, which is a subdivision of Riverside. And it is an incredibly booming, fast-growing community right now. And the high school's really having a hard time keeping up with the rapid growth. Students are coming in at all times of the school year, and they're coming in with a variety of different levels of background knowledge. So because the school it's not a transiency problem, because they're not coming and then, leaving and then coming back. It's just the rapid growth within the community. The school is, like I said, is bursting at the seams, and they're having a hard time onboarding students, especially the students that are coming in the middle of the year. So knowing that that's a challenge, they have their data says that the students don't feel connected to the school, so that engagement is an issue and suspension is an issue. They decided that because of this rapid growth and this need for addressing the climate and culture, that they were going to implement the Mustang Way. Mustang's obviously their mascot. So the Mustang Way is rooted in PBIS, the Positive Behavior Intervention Supports. And that's actual language from their SPSA. That ERHS will implement Mustang Way, a similar positive behavior intervention program as PBIS. ERHS will also implement programs to push for a positive student and social behaviors and increase positive leadership on campus. So I saw one nod, like, yeah, okay, I'm on board with that, and one eyebrow lift and like, huh. So I want you to sit in that uncomfortableness for a little bit. This is directly lifted from their SPSA. And I'm going to leave you in that uncomfortable space because we're going to come back to it. But I want you to mull it over. But in order to do that liberatory design thinking, I need you to be uncomfortable with it. A little more. And again, this is lifted directly from their SPSA. EL students will take field trips to enhance lessons in their sheltered ELA classes, history, science, and math. They're going to implement a support and reward system for the EL students so that they increase their CEL, now LPAC. And EL staff will attend conferences to be trainers of trainers in their SOAP strategies or site strategies. So given the backstory that you saw on this slide, and given what's here, what conclusions do you draw about the demographics of Eleanor Roosevelt High School? Lots of a high population of ELs. And I already told you that they were struggling with their suspensions and their onboarding of students. This is their actual data. 5.3% of their ELs, of their student population, are ELs. Their largest population in terms of student group are their SED kiddos. They're socially economically disadvantaged at 40.2. They do have a large Hispanic population at 45.5%, but that makes a huge assumption that all Hispanic students are ELs. And that, like I said, that's a huge assumption. And right? And that's not a very equitable statement. Their next student group would be the white students at 18.7, and then their African American and Asian students at 12.2 and 14.6. This is what their dashboard data look like. So we're going to focus on the suspension at this point, which is this column. They're all students maintained at 0%, and we're yellow. Their ELs did have a decline, and they are green, and they declined by 1.8%. And their Hispanics had a decline, and they're green. They declined by 0.7%. And I am willing to bet that this maintained at 0%, and this growth here is probably due to that SPSA and the language that you saw, and that there's going to be the Mustang way, and that so much focus was being put on the EL students. But I would also argue that it's coming at the expense of the African American students and the Asian students that are orange. African American students increased by 1.8% and 1.7% for their Asian students. I take you through this so that you can start to see that there are huge equity gaps, and we have a tendency to say, this is the group that needs it because that's my hunch, and a hunch is not a data point, or because I feel pressure to recognize one particular student group, which is fine. That if that is the case, the student group does need to be uplifted, but it doesn't need to come at the expense of another student group. So in the accountability side of it, this is where I propose strategic abandonment. But because we're not doing the accountability side, we're going to rework this into a goal. So looking at this data now and knowing that there are some true equity gaps, does this graphic mean anything different to you now? And it's okay if it doesn't. What changed for you, Yi?
Now after looking at the data, so we realize that there are groups that needed support, and then we don't see somewhat evidence or actions that address the groups that needed support, so then they are not getting equity. So with that, then is not leading to.
Right. Thank you. Barb, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I was just going to say that they're trying to provide things that are going to supposedly create equity amongst the students, but it really isn't. But it really isn't.
Right. I would say that what they're doing is effective for that 5 point whatever it was %. However, like you said, it's coming at the expense of the other 94 point something % of kiddos. So now the challenge is, how do you maintain what is working? How do you keep that sustainable and uplift where those other equity gaps were? That's where your goal writing comes in. So we're gonna change this up on the fly with having such a small group. Given what you know about Eleanor Roosevelt High School, and I understand it's very limited data, and do you guys want? It's very limited data, and that the dashboard is only one data point. I totally get that. When you are doing goal writing, you don't want to just have one data focal point, but for this exercise, we're gonna keep it manageable. So the goals need to be rooted in data, they need to involve stakeholders, and they need to be measurable. So knowing what you know now about Eleanor Roosevelt, draft a goal around suspension, if you would please. And there is no right or wrong to this. So you can address it in terms of actual suspensions. You can actually name the suspension. You can do it at a 30,000 foot view where it would address the climate and culture. But on your index card, if you write a quick goal. The design thinking process says that there are fail-safes, meaning that you learn more from the failures than you do the successes. I just am always careful on how I address that because fail-safe, I don't know, just the introduction of the failure. When people are concerned about getting it right the first time. So know that this is a learning process. I do not expect these first attempts to be gold star. Okay, so like I said, ideally this is to be done with a larger group. So we're going to modify it a little bit, but I'm more interested in showing you the protocol process than the product at this point. And the idea, like I mentioned before, is that SPSAs were never intended to be those exercises in creative writing. They were never meant to be close the door, fill out the boxes, call it a day, hope it gets approved. It was intended to, the intention is that there's rich stakeholder engagement conversation. So your school site council, your ELAC have to be part of those conversations, but you want to include your staff and not just your teaching staff, but your staff at large. You want to include parents and you want to include students, especially at a secondary level. You really want to include students. Because the engagement piece, the climate piece is the hardest at the secondary level. So if we were in a larger group, I would have you pass your card to the right because we're an intimate group. I'm going to have you keep your own. So what I want you to do now is look at the goal that you have, or if you want to swap, you can do that too. It's up to you. And circle anywhere in the goal where you see whom the goal is directed towards. So it would look something like this. To improve the climate at ERHS, all ninth graders will participate in the Mustang Way Assembly. Following the assembly, all ninth graders will be assigned an adult mentor. So given that particular language, I would be circling all ninth graders. You would then pass the card again. We're hoping it's a student group, but it's not always a student group that gets named. So it's for whomever the goal is directed towards. So next, please draw a box around your verbs. Ideally, these are going to be your activities and your actions within the goal. So using my example, improve, participate, and will be assigned is what I have boxed. Then you would pass your card again. This time, underline outcomes. So in using that same, and there can be overlap, that's totally fine, especially where those verbs occur. So if I'm underlining outcomes using that same goal, an outcome is to improve the climate at Roosevelt High School, for students to participate in the Mustang Way Assembly, and for them to be assigned an adult mentor. So underline your outcomes. Then you would pass your card again. And this time, put a star next to measurement. So if you named how or what would be measured, put a star by that. The measurement in this particular goal happens to be missing. So ideally, you would pass your card again, and at this point you should have your original card back. And then you would want to populate out. I did it in a Google Doc for you, but you could do it in a gallery walk poster style. But those things that you notated, so the for whom, the what, so the actions, the outcomes, which is what you underlined, and then how it's measurable, which is starred, would be an independent poster or section in the table. And then you would have the people in the room populate just what was notated. They're not sharing their goal at large, just what was notated. This is a census building activity. So ideally, when you're done, and you could go and you could look at all the who's, all the what's, all the hows, and all the measures, then you could collectively and quickly write a clean goal. So this protocol or process eliminates those hours upon hours in the multipurpose room saying, I think it should be, no, I think it should be, and you don't get anywhere. So this is a quick consensus building activity. So again, since we're an intimate group, we'll just share out rather than populate. So who do you have as your, for whom the goal is written? African-American students? Yes. And Barb? And Asian students? Okay. And what was your boxes, your actions?
Increase.
To increase?
I said to decrease.
Decrease, right? And it should be noted that dashboard data for suspension works in the inverse. No, decrease is correct. Yeah, in the accountability language. Yeah. It's the only one that you want to see a decline.
I write it both ways. I have one side increase, the other side decrease.
Right.
I'll share it a little later.
And what did you underline? So what were the outcomes?
Students' sense of belonging and connecting to the school community.
So building culture. Yes.
So that's the increase part.
Perfect. Thank you. First attempt, it's totally fine. Did you have anything you could star? Anything that could be measured?
Yes. School climate survey.
School climate survey?
Or the healthy space.
Check survey? Mm-hmm.
So I put like 5%.
Oh, more like a SMART goal?
Smart goal.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I would put.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So comments, questions, concerns about what we just did? I know thank you for entertaining me and doing it in a modified version, but
I actually have a bunch. room.
Uh-huh.
If different groups are saying like African American, Asian, and then we can put suspension or graduation. So what if there are more than one area that the group needs to work on? So are we just focusing on suspension for now for this protocol? Like each time when you do a protocol, it's focusing on one thing.
Ideally, you would do this for each goal that you want to write. But then you're populating the same poster. So the who is going to be, all the, right. And then it would just be to uplift that while you had the commonality in your African American students, there was an express need to address Asian students as well. And then you have that maintain component of the ELs as well. So it would be to go and make sure that at the very least, all three of those student groups were addressed in that consensus, and then moving forward from there.
Thinking and defining how much time does that take for the goal, and depending on the group size. So we have a group of around maybe 15 to 20.
We've done it in largest group of 50.
Because if we, when we talk about community at ELAC,
Right.
schools like community, that might be better.
Yeah. It's more time consuming than larger the group for sure. But I'll tell you, the 15 minutes that you spend doing that protocol in comparison to the hours where it's just raise your hand and
The only thing I think that would have helped me is to have an example of a goal, just because, like, off the top of my head, I was like, okay, now I have to think, like,
right.
because I haven't done that in a long time. So that would have been everything that I would say that probably would have helped me.
Right.
Have an idea of what, like, a prime example of what a goal could look like.
And I totally agree with you, but I did that intentionally because ideally the intended audience are SPSA writers. So I want them to have that struggle. But you're absolutely right. That's why but that is why I used the goal as to do the protocol. Right.
And also, when similar to Boston, is that in order to know what yours, you put down specifically, they will do like in a Spanish way, like you were doing Pacific.
Oh, that's lifted from their SPSA. That's not mine.
Yes. So I'm just thinking the general speaking, that all the goals that we look at LCAP is like the increase from this percent to this percent on like that particular indicator as measured by blank.
But the how's usually missing, right?
How is usually
Mm-hmm.
like a strategy.
So that would be where you would push back on the student outcomes. Student outcome in this case isn't necessarily data. Because remember, we had another notation for measurement. The measurement's the data. The outcome is what behavioral changes there's going to be in that particular goal, right? So it's how they're going to access and then what the and then the data would be by 5% or that there's a decrease on the dashboard data or office referrals or whatever the selected measurable data point would be. And you can have multiple data points.
Yes, so I'm also now thinking that usually there is that one person writing it, but there are like our experience and our background also shapes that. Some people might be more comfortable with the academic, so we are thinking about the data and then for the instruction, how it's typically measured, which behavior is being measured,
Right.
which is slightly different. So it's good to keep that in mind too.
And that's why you do it in a group.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
the writer's perspective. So it's good to keep that in mind.
Right. The next component would be to actually fill out that data protocol with the site data or district data or whomever it was that you guys were supporting. You tell me, given the nature of the work that you do you want me just to do an overall explanation and move on? Okay. So this is the same protocol that you saw for Eleanor Roosevelt. Oops. Not trying to make you sick, sorry. This one. So what you would do is you would access your dashboard, and then you're going to populate it with the change data, which is the plus or minus. So plus 6.3, negative 0.1%. And then you're going to notate if it was an increase or a decline, which is also your change data. And then you would assign it its performance level or its color. On the student groups that do not meet the N size, they will still have change data. They just will not have a performance color. So if they did not meet the N size, I would notate the change data and just kind of shade them a light gray so that you know that they did not meet the N size. Because you don't, the whole purpose is the equity, right? You don't want to just say, oh, well, they didn't make it, so we don't need to, because that still could be a significant amount. You could still have 29 students that may not need a goal written specifically for them, but they still need to be uplifted so that you know that those 29 students don't get swept under the rug. And then once you've populated the change data and the performance level, you would then move to the back side of that document, which got the total blues, greens, total orange, red. And you would populate that in terms of, so on Eleanor Roosevelt, they didn't have any students in the all student category that met that. So you would write, no students or a 0, however you want to do your notation. You would note that in the English learners, they were green on suspension, ELA, and I think it was chronic absenteeism. But whatever the indicators were that they were green, you would notate that. And you would do that for each of the student groups. And the reason why you pick the blue and the green and the orange and the red is because the blue and the green are supposed to be your highlight group. If you read the language with that is specifically notated on the LCAP and the SPSA. And then your red-orange is supposed to be the progress, needs progress, greatest need of progress. And then when you're comparing the two, that's where you're going to find where your needs lie. So that part is in the storytelling part of the LCAP and the SPSA, where you're doing your greatest progress, your needs, and your highlights. And it can be lifted directly from this data. This is a timely protocol, but it's a very beneficial one because I can't tell you how many times I've done this with various stakeholders and you hear audible, oh, I didn't know that one. So it just is nice that it provides the mirror and the window. So once you've completed the total numbers of blue, green, and the total numbers of red, orange, you'd want to make sure that you've got a tally down here so you can see where you're overarching, how many student groups were actually in the blue or green and how many were in the orange and the red. And then there are some thought-provoking questions there. First and foremost, uplifting, which student groups had the highest tally, and then the why. It's important to address the kiddos that may have scored in the yellow. They're not, unfortunately, given space in the language of the SPSA or the LCAP, but as a school site and a district, you do want to make sure that you're monitoring them because there's nothing that's keeping them from slipping either way. Those yellow kids could quickly become your green kids, or they could quickly become your orange kids. I'm going to age myself. Those were traditionally called our bubble kiddos. And in this new accountability system, bubble kids no longer exist. You can't play the numbers game like you could with our NCLB accountability because twofold. We're working on sliding metrics now as opposed to stagnant. And we've got multiple means of accountability points now. So we can no longer play the bubble kid numbers game. But you do want to know who the kids are in the yellow because you want to make sure that they don't slip into the orange or red. And you do want to make sure that they're getting the supports to help bolster them into the blue and the green. The next question says, for the student group or groups with the most red and orange, what LCAP SPSA actions and services are explicitly targeted to them? That's another audible, oh, because what we have them normally do is once they've populated this is we have them do an F13 search in either their SPSA or the LCAP and find where the student group that they uplifted is named. And more times than not, like we saw in the Eleanor Roosevelt, they're not named. So we saw that in that suspension, you named African-American students and Asian students, yet they were nowhere in that SPSA goal. So that's where that last question comes in, and where is the need in the actions and services of the LCAP or SPSA. So comments, questions, concerns about that lightning fast explanation about this data protocol. Is it something you think you could use?
I think the process that you went through is definitely. I'm thinking I have to go back in now the meeting structure to just kind of think about. Part of this too is that January 7th meeting.
Mm-hmm.
The one that we're doing next. So I just have to kind of reground myself in the work with SPSA and LCAP because it's been a minute since I've done that.
Right, and it's constantly changing.
So now I just have to go back and like think about how I can connect it.
Right.
The work that I mean, the training I have to do.
My question is, a lot of the times, schools and districts are using local conditions. So I'm just kind of thinking, right, the students moving through tier 1, tier 2, what is the space for us to communicate that? Because, right,
Mm-hmm.
we know that people will say, on the dashboard,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and how do we include the other?
I have a protocol for that too. Yeah. But you're absolutely right. And like I said before, the dashboard's important, but it's one data point. It's how the kiddos may have done in some cases in one day. You know, if they complete their math section in a day, Well, what happened to the other 179? So,
I like the term, those students that are under, I like
yeah, it's important that so many times they're just unintentionally even just pushed to the side. Oh, that number is too small. We don't need to worry about that. Well, if you design to the edges and then you're designing something that is good for all students, but you can then say, this is how we're going to tailor it. So that's your equality piece. And then this is how we're going to tailor it, that equity piece, to this particular student group.
You know, I guess I wonder like the validity of it, right? Like students have standardized tests, like outstanding practices.
Right.
Local is what they do.
Right. And it,
I mean, those are obviously local participants like that.
and it does need to come with a discussion of the system and what systems are in place. And even, so the one that we're going to look at is attendance. But what happens if the attendance clerk is out that particular day and she or he is the only gatekeeper of that particular information? So yes, you need to look at the system too. Yeah, context matters for sure. Some other data protocols and next steps when you follow this would be then, once you've answered those questions, to do an affinity map. So what you would do is identify, like we did suspension. So then you would have the folks sit in clusters and groups, and it's a silent activity, which, believe it or not, is the hardest part of the activity. And they have a stack of Post-its, and they are writing what they believe is a cause factor for the suspensions, one cause factor per Post-it. And they're just stacking up their Post-its. They're just, it's a mental dump, if you will, of all the probable causes that could be contributing to the problem or practice that you're looking at. In this case, it was suspension. Once you've called time, and it usually doesn't need more than 7 minutes. Once you've called time, then with their table mates, and again, they're not allowed to talk to each other, and that is painful to them, you have them categorize at their table all of the Post-its that they came up with. And I strongly encourage you to walk the room and encourage the silence. The purpose behind that is that, again, it's an equity issue. The person that may not feel comfortable speaking up in a staff meeting has now the opportunity to participate without any barriers or limitations, and that particular voice then is uplifted. So once they've sorted and they have their categories or buckets, I transition them to the fishbone, and this is where they're now allowed to talk. So what I have them do is name each of the string of cause factors that they have, and those become these buckets up here. And then they place their Post-its, all the causes, along the bones, if you will. Their problem or practice is going, in this case, African American and Asian students were suspended at a rate 4 times greater than their peers. That's your problem or practice. That would go in the head. And then you have a discussion. The next step would be identify anything that's not in the locus of your control. So my favorite is when they blame the parent or they blame the prior year's teacher. Out of the locus of your control. So you're going to fold that Post-it up. You're not removing it. It's really important. It's symbolic. So it's really important that you don't remove the Post-it. You want to fold it up so that you know, okay, that we can't change that. However, look at all these other things that we can address. Once you have gone through the causes and you have identified the things that are within the locus of your control, then you would want to pick one or two of those causes and run them through a PDSA, a Plan, Do, Study, Act cycle. And in that cycle, you're trying different change ideas, different ways that you think you can better the cause. And it's an iterative process. But ideally, this is going to lead to 1, your goals, and 2, your progress monitoring. So again, that was drive-by because the intention was to have you do this, but with a smaller group. So yeah. Right. I do think though, just with the groups I've worked with, that doing that affinity mapping first makes for the fishbone to be that much more successful. The excuse me, the affinity mapping can be a standalone where then you would just leave it like they have it here. You would just leave it clustered. Yeah. But I think this is a clean next step. Mm-hmm.
Like the group, it's like it's the group with other parents or staff. So in the table group,
Mm-hmm.
they will begin to
Correct. They start with their table group. Well, they start individually with their individual Post-its, and then they categorize at the table silently. So if you keep them in their group to then populate a fishbone, and then you would want to have some accountability. So either a gallery walk with notations or a share out or some kind of accountability to the fishbone.
the problem, it was already identified from the very beginning.
Right. Now you're looking at change ideas. Ways that you can get to the student outcomes.
And the outcomes were already written in that process that we looked at the sheet.
Because that data sheet was already completed. So yes, these 2 activities would come after you complete the data sheet, that deeper dive.
So the problem then, so that at some point after looking at the data, then we would have to
Identify.
articulate
Mm-hmm.
that problem in
Yep.
practice.
Yep. Identify the problem. Yep. How you guys doing? Do you need a quick stretch break? You want to keep going? You want to take a quick pause? Okay. Okay. We'll take a quick break and then we'll come back. When we come back, we're going to do the local data.
And then
Okay. So moving on. You should have said something. I would have put it up for you. Mm-hmm. It's okay. But we can talk offline if you want. So we mentioned that there's local data that's important too, because you need to have a complete picture, right? It's like a connect the dots. If your connect the dots goes to 49 and you only made it to 24, you can assume what the picture is going to be, but if you're not finishing the dot to dot, then so this is not an exhausted list by any means. This is an etc. So this is just a starting point. So office referrals, that data is data that is often not kept, let alone kept with fidelity. And in keeping that data, you want to make sure that you're collecting the positive office referrals as well as the punitive. So if we were to apply that to Eleanor Roosevelt, they said that they were going to use the Mustang Way. They're going to use this PBIS. So how do you measure PBIS, positive behavior, if you're not taking a data sample of the positive behavior referrals that are coming in? And if there aren't positive behavior referrals, then that would be your starting point in your change ideas. You need to create one. You need to start recognizing the kids for doing the whatever is outlined in the Mustang Way. So it's a point counterpoint, if you will, the positive and the punitive. While chronic absenteeism is notated on the dashboard, chronic absenteeism measures any absence whatsoever, excused or otherwise. And it's only measuring it K to 8. So it's important that the high schools are really measuring attendance data, especially by period. Because the chronic absenteeism, there's a difference between truancy and chronic absenteeism. And there is a difference, while it's not great to miss school, period, there is a difference between the unexcused and the excused absences. So you want to do those drill downs, and you want to take into consideration tardies too. So, if you have a child that is habitually tardy, it's worth an empathy interview. Find out what's going on. If it's at the secondary level and you notice that there's a huge mass of kiddos that are missing, that are tardy to 5th period, because that's the period that follows lunch, then that would be something that you would want to address as well. So you want to look at the positive and punitive office referrals. You want to look at attendance data. You want to look at empathy interviews. Again, that's not the finite list. I would argue it's infinitive. We mentioned survey data earlier, so the Healthy Kids survey, the check survey, and that comes in a variety of bases or shapes and forms based on the payment plan. So depending upon what your district has purchased, it could be that only selected grades take it and they take it every other year. It could be that every grade takes it and you take it every year. It could be that one grade level takes it quarterly. There is a staff component to it, but not all sites and districts purchase the staff component. And there's also a parent component, but not all sites and districts are purchasing the parent component either. And that's not to say that one way is any better than the other. It's just know that that it's multifaceted. There's nothing that says you can't have a site developed survey. If you don't want to pay for the Healthy Kids, that's totally fine. You can use a site developed survey. I would just make sure that you take it through a vetting process. If you are collecting data on your own, and or if you're not purchasing the parent side and the stakeholder side of the check survey, then you want to make sure that you're capturing those voices as well in some shape or form. And then I had mentioned earlier when we were looking at the statute, the statute says you have to do a comprehensive needs assessment. However, it doesn't say what a comprehensive needs assessment is. The language refers to a survey. In here, you want to gather demographics, student outcomes, etc., gather survey data. So, I mean, that alludes to the fact that a needs assessment could be strictly a survey. I would argue that it could also be your dashboard. It could also be the local indicator surveys that you're doing. But a needs assessment does need to be done in some shape or form. Wrong way again. Because it was what it was available to me. I don't have access to Illuminate or School Loop or anything. So we're gonna pretend that this is really the attendance data and not just the chronic absenteeism. This one is actually an elementary school because remember I said that this was a K-8 measurement. This is actually the elementary school that I taught at and was a coordinator at in LA Unified. So they had 11.1% of their students that were chronically absent, and they've maintained at 0%. They're still orange. This is their student data. So it's 93.2% SED and 42.9% EL. The student, they didn't have anybody in the red, so kudos to them. Their student groups that were orange were their students with disabilities, Hispanic, and socially economically disadvantaged. So if we go back, oh, it says right there. So 85 students with disabilities, 358 students that were Hispanic, and 381 students that are SED. We had an increase with the students with disabilities, which an increase is actually a negative in this. You want, much like suspension, you want the chronic absenteeism to be going down. And then Hispanic and SED students maintained, but Hispanics had a dip or a rise, however you want to look at it. They were able to decrease the amount of chronically absent students. They, their EL group, because if you looked at the numbers, they had, that was their largest student group breakout. They're yellow at 179 students, 10.1% were chronically absent, and they declined 1.7%. Background, the school this past year, looking at their data, and this is in their SPSA as well, they created a attendance campaign. And in that, they engaged their community liaison and their paras. Those were the primary folks that were tasked with carrying out the attendance campaign. The attendance campaign included parent assemblies that were done in both English and Spanish, electronic mailers. They found that while the mass majority of the families were SED, they may not have had computers at home, but they had mobile phones. And so they could still access the electronic mailers via their mobile phones. And then, of course, the robocalls. And the robocalls were also done in English and Spanish. One of the other change ideas that they instituted were walking school buses. So this particular school is in Panorama City, out near North Hollywood. It's in one side of the school site boundary is industrial, and the other side is very dense apartment living. It's a very high crime, high gang population as well. So they were noticing that the mass mode of transportation was feet. They were walking, and they had to cross some extremely busy streets, and they had to cross gain lines. So when those in and of themselves opposed threats where parents weren't comfortable always sending their kids to school, so they just said, I'll just keep them home. It's fine. When it rained, I don't want you to walk in that distance in the rain, just stay home. So they instituted these walking school buses that each apartment building had a school bus captain, and it was a para, and they would meet down in the lobby of the apartment at said time. They would do a quick head count and then walk the kiddos to school. Umbrellas were provided. The para would, they had some of those huge golf umbrellas, so 3 or 4, 5 kiddos could fit under one umbrella. With that, they were able to move out of the red into the orange as part of the walking school buses. So when you're doing the local data, I would go through what is called a 4 R's protocol, and I cannot take credit for this protocol. This is actually from Deb Sigmund at Wested in Sacramento. This is her protocol. So what you would want to do on this particular protocol is address your data sources. So in this case, we are talking about attendance data. So in the right-hand column, I would write attendance data. And then you're going to go through the 4 R's, the research, the recall, reflect, and respond. So on the research, you want to be looking to see what sources are available. So is there discrepancies amongst students groups in this particular data? So it's the way in which you're extracting the data. You may come up against some resistance and, oh, we can't do that, but you would be amazed with some help from the IT department what I'm at a loss of words. Logarithm, is that right? The data run, the script that they write, and then they can extract amazing amounts of data. How many kids were late because of the walking school buses? How many kids were late because of the, you name it, whatever layer happened that particular day. So that would go in the research side. And you would want to make sure that you're researching as many points as possible. One and done does not work on this protocol. Your recall is when you're going and you're looking at what's the historical data. So, you want to look at year to year. And then I would say that your ideal would be to look within a 3 to 5 year window so that you can really highlight trends. Next comes the reflect. So this is where you would plug in the walking school buses. So walking school buses was a change idea that went into place. There is a fee that's attached to it, right? Because you're paying the paras. you had to buy the umbrellas. Those are really the only two costs that are associated with it. But some of the other things that would have worked was, attendance awards given. Was there some kind of PBIS incentive for attendance? You're reflecting on all of the practices that went into place, all the change ideas that went into place. There's a 5 whys that's also hyperlinked to that. The 5 whys, it comes from the improvement science school of thought, and it's just, you write your problem statement and you ask yourself why, and then you go find the data to support the why, and then you ask the next why. You get to tap into your inner toddler. And then, but the important part is that there's a data point for each one, and a gut feeling or a hunch is not a data point. You have to have the hard, fast numbers to back it up. When you've exhausted your data points, then your 5 whys is done. 5 is an arbitrary number, but it sounds good, right? 5 whys. And that goal, it's just so that you're constantly testing your change ideas. That's the goal behind the 5 whys. And then the respond would be ways that you could help either sustain or move it forward. And then other notes is just that. So again, had we been a larger group, we would have actually gone through that with their with some local data. But thoughts, comments, concerns around this particular protocol and or the 5 whys? Because this is a 2-in-1. Correct.
And then from here, we look at the dashboard, and then we're looking at the data to do the fishbone, or how does this do?
The 4 R's is independent of the fishbone. So because you're flushing it out in the columns, in each of the columns. And you're testing your change ideas in the reflect or recall, reflect, respond is when you're testing your change ideas. Yes, but you would want to start with gathering your data sources, this first column. And that's where, if you put an indicator along this source, then you want to name all of the data sources that you're using. So if you're looking at attendance data, you might also want to look at office referrals. And this is where we were talking about the systems thinking. So you might want to look and see, is there a particular teacher at the secondary level where they're taking attendance per period? Is there a particular teacher that infamously either doesn't take attendance or submits it late, or goes, oh yeah, I think the kid was here, and clicks. You also want to make sure that TAs and students aren't collecting data, attendance data. It's against ed code. It's a common practice, but it is against ed code because there's data in there that is sensitive for students. So I have, to that point, I have seen some school districts get around where there's, they code differently. So it doesn't mean anything to anyone other than whomever has the decipher for the code. And even though you're not supposed to, I would argue that that's probably okay. I mean, having been in the secondary level where you only get the kiddos for 50 minutes, every minute counts, so I get it. Ideally, after you have completed that 4 Rs with your group, then you would go through that goal activity that we went through again. So they could, you want to make sure that you're moving on the the horizontal on that component. So you would, while you're working vertically to capture each of the R's, your ultimate over here is going to be your goal activity. And we would go back through that goal activity again, where they would make sure that the student groups, or they're identifying for whom the target is directed towards. They're making sure that there are true actions in there, that the verbs aren't passive, that you're underlining that there are true outcomes, and then again, that it's measurable. Wrong way. So this 4 R's is a great catapult into progress monitoring. So the law says, or Ed Code says, that your school site councils are supposed to be your governing body for your SPSAs. They're supposed to be a part of the design team. If you happen to have ELAC at your school, it is also supposed to go to them, and ELAC is actually supposed to approve before school site council approves. There is a hierarchy. When you are going through the progress monitoring, though, you want to make sure that it's specific, it's targeted. I would highly advise that you pick one tool and you stick with it for the year. Initiative overload is real, and if you're trying to add another layer of complexity, then it's not going to happen. Make sure that the monitoring doesn't fall on just one person for that same reason. I would put some protocols and procedures in place for how often it's being revisited and with whom it's being shared with. And then ultimately, you want to get to data-driven decision making. That's the ultimate goal. So my proposal to meet that would be that your progress monitoring is a standing agenda item on your school site council ELAC. And every time you have a meeting, monthly, quarterly, however often your ELAC and SSCs meet, you're going through your progress monitoring tool. Little misnomer, school site councils aren't there to approve budgets. They are there to evaluate programs. It's an urban myth that they exist to say, oh, no, we don't need to do Renaissance learning anymore. It's a waste of money. No, you don't want to look at the money that's being spent. You want to see if Renaissance learning is generating any student outcomes. If Renaissance learning is not generating the desired student outcomes, then you have the strategic abandonment discussion. Not, it just costs too much money, get rid of it. You have in your Padlet an example, and it's nothing fancy, it's a Google Doc of a progress monitoring tool. So you would want to take the goal, and this one, it's increase the level of student engagement by 50%, especially for student groups that were identified with a red or orange level on the 2019 dashboard. The people that are going to be responsible, because we're looking at engagement, you've got attendance clerks, counselors, CWAs, child welfare officers, and administration are going to monitor weekly attendance. So it's not just one person. That gatekeeper, that attendance clerk, like I said, God forbid she have the flu and she's out for a week, or he's out for a week. It should be multiple eyes on the data. In quarter one, you're going to put every time, in this case, it was the cost team that was meeting. So every time the cost team met, they put in the dates. But if it were something that was not going to be monitored in that particular quarter, you would just gray out the quarter. Here it says interventions will be implemented and monitored weekly, and empathy interviews will be conducted. So these are the actions and the services built around this particular goal. And then when it's happening and by whom. So what you would do is you would bring this out at every school site council, every ELAC meeting, and just have a discussion about it. We noticed from our the number of cost meetings that we've had between now and the last school site council meeting that we're seeing fifth period tardies decrease by 6%. And that change went into effect once we decided as a school that all teachers were going to stand outside their door and greet their students. So that there's that constant if-then statements are being examined. Comments, questions, concerns about the progress monitoring tool? Like I said, it's nothing fancy, it's a Google table. This actually came out of differentiated assistance last year. That's a real progress monitoring tool for a particular school site that was trying to address chronic absenteeism in their CSI. Nothing? Yes, sure. So it's important that you have the data teams in place. And I would challenge you to think outside of the box when you're creating your data teams. You want to make sure that you have a variety of voices at the table and that they are truly given the opportunity to just speak into the work. This African proverb I love. If you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So again, if you wanted to go quickly, it's going to be your exercise. Your SIPS is going to be your exercise in creative writing with your closed door. Not sure what kind of impact it's truly going to have in your continuous improvement. But if you take the time and gather collective minds and actually go through the progress monitoring, I would wager that there's going to be sustainable change. A savanna picture, kind of, that's an African savanna, kind of doesn't, turned out a little blurry. There is, it's 276 pages, I think, it's on the Padlet, but there is, from the National Academy of Sciences, there is a monitoring education equity study. What I did was I uplifted for you just some of the quick things, but they have outlined 7 domains and 16 indicators that look at educational equality. These happen to be the 7 domains. So what the argument is that depending on your context, that you would have these 7 domains highlighted in some capacity in your SPSA's LCAPs. So on your, either in the goal itself or in the actions and services. So an example to that is I can't tell you how many times, because the SPSA goals have to be lifted from the LCAP goals, that the SPSA goals at an elementary school says all students will graduate college and career ready. Fabulous. What does that mean for an elementary school kiddo? So when you're looking at that, so whether or not a kiddo makes it in school and stays in school is based upon their kindergarten readiness. So if you're not addressing kindergarten readiness as an elementary school, then you're never going to make, as a district, that LCAP goal where all students are graduating college and career ready. So I would just encourage you to look and some of those loftier goals through this funnel. When I found it, it made it more digestible for me. So I share that pro with you. So we said at the beginning that we wanted to uplift school site equity and equality. How'd we do? Do you feel like that was accomplished? And we said that we wanted to empower through data, equity and equality and strategic planning. How'd we do? So then I want to make sure everybody signed in, that you complete your evaluation forms. Please know that the conversation doesn't have to end here. You can reach us at the Inclusion Collaborative and or my email there. With you guys being in the building, you know exactly where to find us. There's also a certificate of completion there for you. But mostly I want to thank you for spending the time with us today and going on the journey. It's this, oh, my pleasure. It's the students that are actually going to benefit from it. So thank you. On their behalf, thank you.